This video is kindly sponsored by Fabulous, the #1 self-care app to help you build better habits and achieve your goals. Hey, 42 here. They say you should never bring a knife to a gunfight, and as far as I'm concerned, that's sound advice. In fact, I'd probably just recommend politely declining the invitation altogether, if you can get away with that without coming across as rude. Another man who lived by this never bring a knife to a gunfight mantra was Jack Churchill, or Mad Jack Churchill to his friends. Why mad? Just keep watching. Now, like most of us, I constantly give myself a hard time on a daily basis about my diet and water intake. So I've decided to enlist the help of Fabulous to help improve my daily routine and stay healthy. Fabulous makes it easy for anyone to develop and stick to healthy habits, thanks to science-backed daily routines. And, as a result, it makes you feel healthier, fulfilled, and more productive. Fabulous is great because it's 100% personalized, and there are 2 ways you can use it: the guided way, or, like I'm doing, self-guided, where you choose habits from hundreds of options, and Fabulous helps to embed those chosen good habits into your life through behavioral science principles, timely reminders, and science-backed content. And unlike other self-development apps, Fabulous is gentler, more rewarding, fun, and offers a more supportive approach, which I found works really well for me. Fabulous has had an amazingly positive impact on my life in such a short period of time as well, and I know it can do the same for you. Start building your ideal daily routine. The first 500 people who click on the link will get 25% off Fabulous Premium. Anyway, Jack took part in a great many gunfights in his life, including the biggest gunfight of them all, the Second World War. And whilst he didn't come armed with a knife, what he brought instead wasn't much better, because Mad Jack Churchill went to fight the panzer-driving, machine-gun-toting Nazis with a broadsword and a longbow. You might be assuming from this unusual choice of armament that Churchill was some kind of British ninja, Metal Gear soldiering the Nazis to death with silent but deadly weapons. And that would make sense. Except I haven't told you about the other weapon Jack Churchill chose to bring along to his many gunfights: his trusty bagpipes. Now, I'll be the first to admit that I'm not up to speed on the latest ninja trends, but I'm fairly sure bagpipes aren't considered part of the standard kit. Not even in Scotland. The funny thing is, despite his, shall we say, eccentric choice of armament, Mad Jack Churchill was a truly brilliant soldier, with a war record that's passed into legend. Some of the things he did during the Second World War and beyond are so remarkable, it's hard to believe they really happened. But they did. So, without further ado, this is the story of Mad Jack Churchill, the greatest badass in the history of the British Army. Jack Churchill was born in British Ceylon, which is today Sri Lanka, but during his childhood he also spent time in Hong Kong, England, and on the Isle of Man, where he was educated at the fancy pants King William's College. The world-renowned Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst was next, before Jack got his first army posting in what was then Burma, and is now Myanmar, at the age of 20. Not all that much is known about his military exploits in Burma, but he certainly seems to have enjoyed his time off, during which he explored much of the Indian subcontinent from the back of his prized Zenith motorbike, and found time to master both the bagpipes and archery. As one does. After 10 years in Burma, Churchill decided life was a bit too slow for his liking, and so he resigned in search of other entertainment. He took a job as a newspaper editor in Nairobi, Kenya, and explored his more sensitive side, working as a male model, and even had a brush with Hollywood, acting as an extra in both The Thief of Baghdad and A Yank at Oxford. In 1938, he took some time out to beat a whole lot of Scotsmen to second place in a prestigious bagpiping competition. I bet that made him popular. And the following year, he represented Britain during the 1939 Archery World Championships in Oslo. Let's just say he was one of those utter bastards who's good at everything he does. But Jack's days of leisure were coming to an end. When Britain and France declared war on Nazi Germany in 1939, Jack Churchill found himself amongst close to 400,000 British soldiers sent to France as part of what was known as the British Expeditionary Force. To begin with, things were quiet in France. Too quiet, at least as far as Jack was concerned. He was so bored he actually volunteered to go and join up with the Finnish army, who were busy trying not to get murdered by Stalin's Soviets at the time. Jack was all set to go as well, and had fate not intervened, he might just have found himself fighting alongside another legendary soldier I covered on this channel recently, Simo Häyhä, also known as the White Death, the greatest sniper in history. But it was around this time that swastika-shaped shit started to hit the fan in France, and so the Finland trip was cancelled, as the British Expeditionary Force beat a hasty retreat towards Dunkirk. Whilst the Allies were no match for Hitler's blitzkrieg tactics, at least not at the time, men like Mad Jack Churchill made sure the enemy paid dearly for every Allied life they took. And it was in doing exactly that Jack Churchill first made a name for himself. He and his men were holed up in a small village called Le Epinay when a lookout spotted a large German patrol heading straight for them. So, what do you think Mad Jack Churchill did when faced with a superior force in the middle of what was fast becoming enemy territory? Did he order a silent retreat before the men were spotted? Did he call for reinforcements? Did he take cover and wait for the enemy to pass? Did he bollocks? He sent instructions to his men to prepare an ambush, telling them to take up firing positions focusing on the road that entered the village. Churchill himself would give a signal when it was time to start shooting. As for what exactly that signal was, Mad Jack was crouching in the upper window of a tower when the Germans entered the village. With his men hidden out of sight, Jack waited until the very last moment, then calmly stood, raised his weapon, and fired at the man leading the German column, hitting him full on in the chest. Not with his machine gun, mind you, with a f***ing longbow. So far as anyone knows, this was the only longbow kill of the Second World War, and the last bow and arrow kill by a British soldier in history. Can you imagine what must have gone through the German soldiers' minds as a giant arrow suddenly appeared in their sergeant's chest? Yeah, me neither. They didn't have much time to take it in anyway, because Churchill's men rightly assumed this was their signal and opened fire from all sides. In the meantime, Jack had ditched the bow and sprinted towards the tower, where, raising his favourite broadsword high above his head, he bellowed a war cry and charged into the enemy flank. Why exactly Mad Jack Churchill decided to fight World War II with medieval technology is honestly kind of unknown, though he did take pleasure in telling his men that any officer who goes into action without his sword is improperly dressed. As for whether he was just extremely eccentric, morbidly fascinated with the more visceral ways of dealing death, or just a few sandwiches short of a picnic, your guess is as good as mine. The ambush worked brilliantly, but even Mad Jack couldn't keep the German tide at bay for very long, and eventually he and his men, along with over 300,000 others, made it to Dunkirk, and from there to England as part of the legendary Operation DYNAMO, the biggest military evacuation in history. And it was back in Blighty that Mad Jack got wind of a new elite raiding and reconnaissance force that had just been formed under direct orders from his namesake, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill himself. In case you've been wondering, the two weren't related. Not that the Germans knew that, as we're about to find out. This new force, known as the Commandos, would carry out raids behind enemy lines, disrupt plans and supply chains, and just generally cause utter chaos. As far as Mad Jack Churchill was concerned, it sounded perfect. As an added bonus, training for the Commandos would take place in Scotland, land of Jack's second favourite thing in the world after killing people, the bagpipes. He signed up in a heartbeat. After about a year of training, Jack was ready for his first mission, the rather wonderfully named Operation Archery. The target was the Norwegian island of Vagsøy, a German-held centre of fish oil production. Fish oil might not sound like the highest priority target in the middle of a war, but this stuff wasn't used to grease the joints of old-age pensioners. It was a key ingredient in the manufacture of explosives. By targeting these stores, the Allies would not only hamper the German war machine's bomb production, they'd also draw Hitler's attention away from the far more important Eastern Front. As you've probably gathered already, Mad Jack Churchill was a man who liked to lead from the front, which is why he placed himself in the very first landing craft heading towards the island. Most men who know they're about to be running headlong into a hail of machine gun fire are, quite understandably, a little bit nervous. I'd go so far as to say that unplanned pant wetting would be a perfectly acceptable way to spend those last few moments. But not Mad Jack. Instead of both literally and figuratively shitting himself, as any normal human being would have done, Jack stood defiantly facing the shore, back ramrod straight and eyes on the prize. Then he unfurled his bagpipes, took a deep, full breath, and blasted out an inspiring tune with all the force he could find in his lungs. When the landing craft hit the shore, Jack was the first man on the beach. Slinging his bagpipes over his shoulders, he raised his broadsword high in the air, bellowed a now trademark war cry, and headed towards the German position under heavy fire, lobbing grenades as he went. Needless to say, the Germans didn't know what had hit them, and the island was captured within hours. Operation Archery was a resounding success. The Commandos lost 17 men, but took 120 defenders with them, along with a further 98 prisoners. Considering they were the ones storming the defended position, those numbers are incredible. Even more importantly, in the aftermath of the raid, Hitler diverted 30,000 troops away from the Eastern Front to Norway, spreading his forces even thinner. 2 years later, Mad Jack found himself in Italy, after the Allies' strategic use of a corpse during Operation Mincemeat paved the way for the invasion of Sicily. I did a whole video on that crazy story a little while ago, if you're interested. In Sicily, Jack led a string of devastating raids, ambushes, and counterattacks, completely disrupting German plans in the process. In what might just have been his most famous act of the entire war, well, after longbowing a man to death, obviously, Jack and a single corporal under his command captured an entire German observation post on their own. Jack's plan of attack was pretty straightforward. He simply snuck up on the isolated sentries and introduced them all to his broadsword. The two men managed to capture the post and take 42 prisoners on their own without firing a single bullet. The next stop on Jack's War Worlds tour was Yugoslavia, where the Commandos were busy harassing German forces stationed along the Dalmatian coast. But it was here that Mad Jack's mad luck finally ran out. In what was probably the most dangerous mission of his entire career, Jack led one of 3 forces attempting to capture the German-held island of Brac, part of what is now Croatia. Churchill's unit was to storm a key strategic hilltop on the island, where the Germans were well dug in behind minefields and barbed wires. Under cover of darkness, Churchill and his men started up the hill towards the enemy. Well, I say under cover of darkness. Any element of surprise was probably somewhat undermined by the fact that Churchill himself led the charge, playing his bagpipes at maximum volume. The German position was indeed overrun, but it came at a huge cost. Only 6 commandos, including Jack, made it to the top of the hill, and there was still plenty of Germans left when they got there. The situation was pretty bleak. Jack and his men had hardly any ammo left between them, and with incoming fire raining down from all sides, they were being picked off, one by one. Before long, Jack was the only man left alive and uninjured. He knew there was no chance of escape, and no way of taking out all of the German soldiers before the inevitable arrival of a bullet with his name on it. And so, in a scene so incredible, it's hard to believe it really happened, Jack laid down his carbine. With enemy soldiers closing in, grenades blowing up all around him, and mortar shell explosions inching ever nearer to his position, Mad Jack Churchill picked up his bagpipes once more, and as loudly as he could played "Will Ye Not Come Back Again," as death came for him. It was a mortar round that got him in the end. The aftermath of the explosion all looked quieter, because Jack's piping finally had ceased. But Mad Jack Churchill's story doesn't end quite yet. It was going to take more than a mere mortar shell to keep him out of the war. The blast had knocked him out cold, but soon enough he was coming round. Unfortunately, he woke up to find himself surrounded by enemy soldiers. And that was very bad news indeed, because it meant he was at the mercy of something called the Commando Order. You see, the newly formed commandos had given Hitler so much trouble that he decreed any of their number who were captured should be shot on sight and without a trial. Dazed from the mortar blast and relieved of his weapons, bagpipes included, it seemed Jack's position was entirely hopeless. He was surrounded by men with orders to end his life, no questions asked. So, how did he get out of this one? Well, for once, it had nothing to do with bravery and broadswords. In fact, it was a stroke of pure luck that kept him alive: his name. The Germans were well aware that several of Winston Churchill's relatives were in active service in the British Army at the time, and in Mad Jack Churchill, they mistakenly believed they'd gotten their hands on the British Prime Minister's nephew. As a result, Jack was taken to Germany and a concentration camp called Sachsenhausen. Like all concentration camps, it was a truly horrific place. All told, 200,000 men, women, and children were brought to the camp during the course of the war. Only half of them made it out again. From the moment Mad Jack arrived, there was only one thing on his mind: getting the hell out of there. And, as luck would have it, he soon met several like-minded individuals who happened to know a thing or two about mounting a successful escape. Bertram James, Harry Day, Sidney Dowes, and Johnny Dodge, the Artful Dodger to his friends. Those names might not mean anything to you, but I'm pretty sure you'll be familiar with their story. Because those men were all survivors of, arguably, the most famous breakout in history. The mass escape from Stalag Luft 3, better known as the Great Escape. Sachsenhausen concentration camp was no match for this bunch of expert escape artists, and together they tunneled under a wall and disappeared into the countryside. It was a fairly precarious form of freedom though. Sachsenhausen was just north of Berlin, in the middle of enemy territory. Jack figured his best chance was to head for the coast some 100 miles away, and along with Bertram James, he almost made it by hitching rides on passing freight trains and hiking through the German countryside. But the men were recaptured just miles from the coast near the city of Rostock. Another stint in a concentration camp followed, this time in Dachau, before Churchill and 100 or so other high-profile prisoners were sent south to Austria. The war was almost over at this point, and security was beginning to slip, so Jack was able to escape the Germans once again by simply walking off when the power at his camp failed. Another long journey lay ahead of him, this time south into Italy. He hiked alone through the Brenner Pass, and 100 miles later, bumped into an American patrol near Verona. He was saved. Jack spent the next few years seeking out military action wherever he could find it. He first got himself sent back to Burma in hopes of fighting the Japanese in the South Pacific. But by the time he arrived, nuclear devastation had been unleashed on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the war was officially over. Jack retrained as a parachutist at the age of 40 and was posted to British Palestine, where he once again excelled in his own unique way. At one point, attempting to defend a medical convoy from a huge ambush with just 12 men, and later helping to evacuate 700 people from a hospital in Jerusalem. But Jack did finally accept that touring the world in search of wars to fight in was more of a young man's game, because eventually he stopped trying to kill people and took a desk job. Not that he ever lost his trademark eccentric streak. It's said he used to startle passengers during his commute home on the train by standing up and suddenly flinging his briefcase out of the nearest window. It wasn't quite longbowing a man to death, but it wasn't far off by London commuter train standards. Jack had his reasons though. It turned out the train went right past his house, and he was simply throwing the briefcase into his garden to save himself the trouble of carrying it home. He remained a bit of a thrill seeker too, even in his senior years. Whilst working as an instructor at the Land Air Warfare School in Australia, Jack took up surfing, a hobby that would become a lifelong passion. In 1955, just shy of his 50th birthday, Mad Jack Churchill became the first man to surf the River Severn tidal bore on a surfboard he'd designed and built himself. Today, thousands of enthusiasts follow in his footsteps every year. Considering he was an absolute maniac who laughed in the face of danger, well, bagpiped, it's pretty remarkable that Mad Jack Churchill made it to old age at all. But make it to old age he did. Jack passed away in 1996 at the grand old age of 89. Gone, but most certainly not forgotten. Thanks for watching.